Hello, welcome to yet another episode of Bajeti Speaks podcast. And today we are yet again to discuss another PFM topic, an interesting one, because I know this is one of the topics that has been gaining a lot of momentum. And we get to discuss about public debt. And who else to lead this conversation other than one of my colleagues at Bajeti Hub? So I'll just give him a minute just to introduce himself, tell us who he is and the role that he plays at Bajeti Hub.
My name is Cuba Houghton. I work for Bajeti Hub as our budget financing lead, which means I lead our programmatic work around dealing with the question of how is it that the government finances its public budgets and its public services through things like tax and increasingly public debt. I also lead our work in the northeastern region of the country, supporting local practitioners to engage better in local budget processes. And I'm here today, of course, to discuss our recent research paper around public debt and the social cost of public debt.
Thanks. Maybe just to start us off, you said that you're our budget financing lead. So maybe you could just spend a minute or so just to tell us like what sparked your interest in that specific area of work, because I know it's one that people might see that has a lot of numbers that keep running around, one that might be complex to some people in terms of just understanding the different terms and how things go about there. So maybe what sparked your interest in budget financing and even for the paper that we are discussing here today, which is on the social cost of public debt in Kenya.
Yeah.
So maybe what was the thought behind that particular paper?
Yeah, so it's interesting because for most Kenyans, when you think about public budgets or public finance, you think about the spending side. So where is the government spending money? Where is it not spending money? Is it spending in health, education, among others? But I got really curious about where the money is coming from, right, when it comes to our public budget. So, of course, typically governments have four main sources of income in order to finance services. So that's public debt, which is borrowing, taxes, which is the biggest one in Kenya, which is basically the taxes that's collected from all of us. There's overseas development assistance as well, among others. So, and public-private partnerships as well. So those are the main four. And so our budget financing work kind of focuses on how it is that those ways of collecting revenue, collecting income, actually enable public services. Because before you even spend the money, you have to really collect it. And you have to collect it in a way that's sustainable, which is kind of what brought a bit of the curiosity around the paper we're doing now, which is, as a Kenyan, I first grappled with the question of, you hear a lot about this problem of public debt in Kenya. You hear it in the media, you hear it, from the president, you hear it from different parts of government. But I was really curious about like, what exactly is the problem with public debt? Like, why is it a big thing now? So that's kind of on a personal level. But I think on a professional level, I started to notice that there's a connection, and colleagues at Bajeti Hub as well, we started to notice there's a connection between government budget financing decisions and its decisions about how to enable public services. So, for example, over the past few years, one of the big topics of interest has been, how the government has funded social sectors like health and education. So, of course, in health, we saw the Social Health Authority, or SHA or SHIF, which then replaced NHIF quite savagely. But one of the things you notice is that there was a lot of these policies that are being introduced to try and change how we spend in health and in education. In education, we're talking about the higher education funding model at the university level. You're talking about changes to the school feeding program, among others. And so my question was, where is all of this coming from, right? As much as, you had a new administration, which is the current administration, and a lot of, new ideas on how things can be done, it seemed like there was pressure from somewhere. And where the curiosity really tipped was around the finance bills of 2022, 2023, 24, 25, where we see the government was really thirsty for revenue. Like, we need to collect taxes everywhere. But at the same time, you look at the economy and you're like, hey, or you look at your pocket and you're seeing that Kenyans' income is actually not growing as much. And so one of the real concerns I was kind of grappling with is, where is the pressure for all of these reforms and things coming from? And then, pretty quickly when you look into the numbers around the budget, you see that Kenya has this massive public debt bill. So this massive amount of money that we have to pay it's an obligation to our creditors that we have to pay every year. And so I began to see, okay, maybe that's the place that the pressure is coming from. But what's the cost of us paying these debt obligations? And so that kind of, was what inspired the paper titled The Social Cost of Public Debt.
Thanks, Cuba, for just taking time just to explain where the paper is actually coming from. One of the things that many Kenyans, and I know even for us, it's something that you're also trying to unpack, is that public debt is not like a new thing per se. So when you look at even the history of public debt, it goes way back to many years before. And one of the questions that I know many people will ask is why is public debt of concern now, and how did we actually get to where we are?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because Kenya has been borrowing since independence, even before independence. I think one of our deals going into independence was actually a loan from the British government. But so the paper that we did actually looks at the last 30 years, so analysis of the last 30 years. So basically since 1998. And we found a couple of events, especially in the last 10 years, that have led to public debt kind of becoming really big as an issue. And there are three main events that we highlight in the paper, one of which is that Kenya had to set out in the early 2000s its big development dreams. That's what we call it in the paper. And essentially this refers to Vision 2030, which is this development blueprint that Kenya set out in order to, I think the goal is to move from a third world country to a first world country, which is, I think, rhetoric that's becoming quite popular nowadays. And what the Vision 2030 did is that it set out the goals that would be achieved by successive governments over time. And among some of those goals were significant investment in health, education, among others. But one of the key components of Vision 2030 was some of these big, they call the flagship or, very big infrastructure projects that require a big amount of investment that would need to be made over a certain period of time, which makes sense because if you want to develop as an economy, one of the schools of thought is that you invest in infrastructure that can actually enable economic growth. So you build a highway, like the Nairobi Thika Highway, that actually allows for businesses to set up along the highway so that people can actually make income, because of people will be transitioning past. Or using it as transport. And so what happened is that it created what's known as an infrastructure deficit. So you set out the amount of infrastructure that you need versus what you have. Now the difference between that is the deficit. Now in order to fill that deficit, the government has had to fork up a lot of finance, right? A big amount of capital in a short period of time. And one of the best ways to do that is to borrow, right? You can't suddenly tax Kenyans, 10 trillion in a year or 1 trillion. So that's kind of one of the areas that kind of caused us to start to look to loans. Another one was that, around 2014, Kenya became a sort of a bigger economy. It was classified in the global kind of architecture of the global economy as it moved from being a lower income country to a lower middle income country, which is a very small semantic adjustment, but it also meant that it was because it was being reclassified as a kind of a richer economy, right? So it means that it lost access to some key finance, concessional finance, which is cheaper. And so now, because of that, and because of this infrastructure deficit, we had to go looking for loans in more expensive places, which gave birth to Eurobonds, which are commercial loans, syndicated loans, which generally are just more expensive. But typically, excuse me, depending on the global climate, they're a bit easier to get than going to the domestic markets, for example, for loans. And so we started to take on a bit more debt. So the proportion of our debt that was commercial or expensive started to increase. The final kind of piece of the puzzle touches on some of the events that have happened between in the last 10 years. So in order for the Kenyan government to respond to certain economic and social shocks, it's had to actually borrow. So a great example, of course, is the COVID-19 pandemic, where Kenya had to kind of immediately ramp up its response towards the health crisis. And so we took on loans from World Bank, among others, in order to, get protective equipment, build hospitals, whatever needed to be done at the time. And so, in a period of about 6 months in 2020, the debt went up by 11%, our debt stock, which is about 600 billion, which is quite significant. So those are some of the events that have contributed to public debt becoming such a big story, and our public debt actually going to over half of our GDP, and over 12 trillion now. Yeah.
Thanks for just unpacking some of the events that have really led to like our debt increasing over time. Because I know even for Kenyans, it's usually one of the conversations that people will ask, why have we accrued so much debt within like a short period of time? But just to get into the paper, we discussed the social cost of public debt. And this is basically bringing the conversation down to the common mwananchi who are actually supposed to benefit from the services from these publicly funded things that some have been done through public debt. How would you how does that look? How would you quantify it?
Yeah, so the idea for the title, which is the social cost of public debt, came from this tension that we found that governments have to face, especially governments that have high debt, which is, on the one hand, you have an obligation to your creditors, so the people that you owe money, right? You kind of just have to pay, because that has bad implications if you don't, right? You don't want to default. On the other hand, you have obligations to your citizens. So you have services that you need to finance. You need to finance social health care. SHA needs to continue running, which is Social Health Authority, which deals with social health insurance in Kenya. Salaries need to continue being paid for teachers, policemen, among others. And so, each government has to kind of make trade-offs and decide which one is more important at any given time. And so that refers to kind of the cost aspect. But what we found is when we started looking at the numbers, spending on social services, and the paper focuses on health, education, and social protection, it has been rising, right? And so that's positive, of course, because, population is growing, the government needs to spend more money. But when you look at as a proportion of the budget, it's still rising. But when you look at it in terms of how much the government has spent on debt relative to these social sectors, it's actually, the amount that's being spent on debt is actually a lot higher, right? So now we're talking about, out of, debt is taking up about a third of our budget, right? Roughly, I think the debt payments we're making is now standing at 1 trillion. Over 1 trillion, which is actually more than we're spending on education, health, and social protection.
Yeah.
So it's quite concerning. But yeah, the trend that we saw over time is that more of the budget, that's both spending, but also more of the income, so the revenue we're collecting, is going towards debt, right? So in around 2014, we were talking about, debt was taking up maybe 40 of every 100 shillings that we collect in taxes, but now we're talking about upwards of 60, 70 out of every 100 shillings. And that creates a problem because the amount of shillings that you are remaining, whether it's 20 or 30 shillings, is what you have for delivering these other services. And so the social cost kind of speaks to this tension, which is that as the government borrows, of course, it's borrowing to spend, right? So it's borrowing to spend in health, borrowing to spend in education. But as the government is borrowing, we're seeing that the increase in spending on social services is not as high as it could be. So it got us thinking about maybe there's this effect that public debt is having on social services that we weren't aware of before. And it's great you raised the point about the common mwananchi, and the question of why it is that they should care about public debt. And this is the reason why, because there's this idea going into the paper as we were developing the concept for the paper, that public debt is actually affecting whether or not your child's teacher has a salary, right? Whether or not social insurance is being provided to you, among others. And so what the paper does in trying to quantify that, because again, that was our assumption, looking at it from the outside, just the trends analysis. But what the paper actually does to quantify it is that we looked at data over the past 30 years from publicly available sources, from the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, World Bank, among others, and the IMF, and of course the National Treasury. We looked at spending data on health, social protection, education, on public debt as well. And we did a linear regression analysis to basically to determine what the effect of public debt or Kenya's public debt burden has been on social services over time. And we found very interesting results. So for example, one of the main results we found is that a 1% increase in the debt stock actually decreases social spending in education, health, and social protection by 3% annually. And you're talking about 3% of collectively, upwards of 1 trillion or 1.2 trillion, right? So you're talking about a lot of money. And so we actually were able to confirm that negative relationship. We found that, of course, interesting things like when it comes to one of the sectors that's most affected by debt is education. Which is interesting because when the government borrows, not a lot of that money ends up in the education sector. But when the government pays for debt, the debt payments actually compete with the education sector because the costs that you see in the education sector, majority of the budget is recurrent costs. So paying of salaries, the TSC has one of the biggest, I think it's the biggest ministry, department, and agency in the Kenyan budget. But that's the same. It comes from the same pot that the debt payments come from, which is also recurrent, so-called consolidated fund services. And so you find that the education sector normally competes, or one of the tensions we found is that it probably competes actually with debt payments. And so, we found a 1% increase in public debt reduces education spending by 2.4%, with about the effects on health and social protection being about 1% or so. And so those are some of the things that we found, but it still left us with the question, of course, of why all of those things will happen. But that's how we went about the paper.
Just a quick one there, because I know maybe for there are people who would argue that we can just prioritize the social sectors that we've spoken about. But I think the main concern is usually with the fact that with debt, it's a fast charge. So before we sort any other social services per se, there's this list of some of the things that we have to pay first, and then the resources that are left is what is used to pay for the social sectors. Maybe you could just paint a picture of how that has looked like and how that scenario looks like in terms of the figures, if there are any percentages of how it has actually even reduced what goes to actual services to citizens.
It's a great question, because it again touches on this aspect of where does the rubber meet the road when it comes to debt. And so one of the ways that we highlight in the paper is what we call the liquidity challenge, right? And you can imagine, like, even in your personal life, when you borrow a lot of money, suddenly the amount of your income, whether it's your business or your salary, that you have to put towards paying the debt, it increases. But still your other costs are there. You may have health insurance, you may have education costs, maybe you're educating yourself or educating your children. And so what happens is that when your salary hits your account, or your money hits your account, at that point you have to decide, am I going to pay these debts, or am I going to pay for health and education and all these other things that are important to me, rent, right? And that's the same decision that the National Treasury has to make, right? Like you rightly say, public debt is considered a first charge. And what that means is that it's a first priority when it comes to making payments from the government's bank account, right, which is known as the Consolidated Fund Services, or CFS. Other first charges are like pension payments, payments to independent institutions, among others. So there's a kind of prioritization that's done at the point of disbursing money, within government accounts. And so what happens is that throughout the financial year, of course, taxes are collected daily, right? So it's not that, money comes at the beginning of the year, then we budget. So that's the benefit that we have that government doesn't have. But the government gets tax revenues, consistently. And so at any point where it needs to disburse money, it needs to decide, okay, how much of this needs to go towards debt and how much of this needs to go towards payments to counties or payments to, the education in public schools, capitation, for example. So the reason why you call it the liquidity challenge is because at any given point, the government is not liquid enough. It doesn't have enough money to fulfill all the needs. And one of the places where which connects to a very interesting conversation around counties and their service delivery. Because, of course, Kenya's system of governance has it that counties have to deliver services. Counties have to spend money as well on services. But, a majority, up to 80% of counties' budgets actually comes from the national government. It's called the equitable share from the national government. But also that equitable share is part of that decision of whether to pay on debt or whether to pay on other things. So what happens is that counties often receive a lot of their money towards the end of the financial year, which means that for typically the first 2 quarters, not much is going on in counties, which of course creates the perception from citizens that counties aren't doing much. But in reality, it's this public debt problem and how much we need to spend on public debt constantly in order to not default on our obligations, which is also now an implication, that's causing counties to underperform, for example, or causing certain ministries, departments, and agencies not to be able to provide certain services. So in a very important way, public debt really does affect how it is that the government is able to even appear legitimate to citizens and is able to deliver services. Now, you also mentioned very quickly an interesting point, which is that some people may say, let's just prioritize social spending, right? Forget about our creditors, whether the debts are illegitimate or not. Of course, there's a conversation about odious debt and different things. But from experience, it's not that easy, because there are some countries, because what it means is that if you're going to prioritize the payments that have to do with your country, right? I'm going to prioritize education spending or whatever, and we'll forget about debt payments. It means that the people that we owe, of course, are going to come knocking. And what that will mean, of course, is that you'll probably have to default, which basically means that you tell someone, can't pay, won't pay. Right, and some countries have done that around the world, especially because they don't have enough money. So we're talking about Ghana, we're talking about Zambia, among others, even Ethiopia recently. But that comes with its own implications, because it means that because government borrows both externally and domestically, right? So if you're telling people can't pay, won't pay, you're telling that to IMF, World Bank, bilateral partners. But if you're telling but you're also telling that to domestic lenders. And that's you and me typically, but well, that's if you if you indulge. But of course, a majority of domestic bondholders are banks, pension funds, SACCOs. So that means the government is telling SACCOs that we are not going to pay, right? We are not going to pay you what you the money that you give us in terms of the bonds. And so that means that your dividends that you're expecting will disappear. That means people who are dependent on pension payments, they'll likely disappear, or they'll take what they call a haircut, which is when they reduce the amount. So it comes with very difficult ramifications if we decide to just prioritize social spending. But what the position that we've had at Bajeti Hub, it's also one of the things we argue in the paper, is actually, as opposed to just saying we won't pay, is actually just trying to go to our creditors and say, this is how we can reduce the burden on social services. So we call it debt restructuring. So able to use different. And the government, one of the things that's quite positive is the government has actually been pursuing that. So using different methods to just kind of maybe extend the period over which you need to pay the debts, or, swap the currency, among others. So that's why it's a bit of a complex path.
Yeah. So throwing us further into the works, I know governance really has like a very key part when you discuss public debt. And reading through the paper, it seems to come out that part of the reason why we are where we are right now is because of bad governance in terms of how the debt has been managed, in certain instances, how the debt has actually been acquired. So maybe what does governance has to do with public debt, and how do we actually suffer from some of the bad decisions that are made in terms of how public debt is acquired and even utilized?
Yeah, it's a very important question, because it has almost everything to do with public debt. And as we're writing the paper, of course, the question, as we've had the conversation, you may be asking yourself, is this something that's only happened to Kenya? Like, what makes Kenya special? Why is it that we have this public debt problem? And is it that, like, what is it that is causing Kenya to struggle with public debt? And it's a good question, because it's important to understand that public debt is not this external part of Kenya's budget. Like, it's not this special thing that happens on the side. It's actually an integral part of the budget process, right? So this is the 4-stage process to which the government, in collaboration with citizens, actually decides on how resources are to be raised and to be spent. Now, the section for resources where decisions around resources, how resources are going to be raised or kind of collected, that's where public debt lies, right? So in the formulation stage of the budget cycle, where we're saying, okay, these are priorities and these are how we are going to fund them. And so there is a process through which public debt should follow by law. Public debt management, right? There's a process through which we should borrow. So, for example, the law says that we can only borrow for the purposes of development, right? And that's based on the basic principle that ideally you want to borrow in a way that produces income for the future, and that's through development. So it would then mean that if there's all these processes and procedures, laws that are to guide this, if we're in crisis now, it means that there must be a failure somewhere, right, in that system, or within the actors in the system that's causing this problem. Because as if you look at the law, although it's not completely clear on some aspects, the rules are clear in terms of how you're supposed to deal with public debt and acquire public debt, public participation, debt sustainability analysis, all of these different things. And so one of the things we sought to see in the paper is like, okay, if we're saying that a 1% increase in public debt has a negative effect on social spending by -3%, what if we were to try and measure the quality of governance and see how it changes the equation or changes the results? And so what we did is we went and found some world governance indicators developed by the great team there at the World Bank, that actually measure the quality of certain governance indicators like rule of law. So how has Kenya been performing on rule of law, on voice and accountability, on control of corruption, and government effectiveness as well. And so we're able to put it across our data for 30 years and actually able to see whether there's an impact. And what we found is that when you account for the quality of, or rather when you improve the quality of governance, that -3% actually turns positive. So it means that when you increase the quality of governance, the negative effect that public debt has on a country's burden, in this case Kenya, can actually turn positive. Right? So public debt can actually become an enabler of social services, which is how it's envisioned, in the Constitution and Public Finance Management Act. But of course, it still comes back to the question of why is Kenya not doing, why is the effect negative in Kenya? And so, of course, there seems to be some sort of governance deficit. And in the paper, we highlight a few. One of them is on the legal framework, right? So what are the parts of the legal framework that is hindering public debt from being positive? And one of the things that we found is the law is not as clear, or there's no explicit legal provision on the requirements for loan terms, or the terms of loans agreements, to actually be disclosed to the public, right? More than that, there's no legal provision that these loan agreements even have to be brought to Parliament. That's your National Assembly, your Senate, which means that the executive or National Treasury can actually enter into loan agreements and commit the country to years of paying loans or paying back debt without the approval of any representative of the people, right? Without public participation, without whatever. So what that means is, of course, it opens kind of a loophole for what they call odious debt, or debt that, we kind of lack accountability over and perhaps could be considered illegitimate. And so we found that that's a big deficiency where like if the agreements were to be brought to Parliament was able to analyze them, of course, with the Attorney General as well, that it create a bit more accountability over how the government borrows and the executive borrows. Another one was around how debt decisions are made, so specifically public participation, which we highlight in the paper, which we find that although over time, which is very positive, there's been more conversation and public participation between, of course, state and non-state on public debt management decisions, they still remain a bit, flawed and tokenistic, to be quite frank, specifically on public debt management. So, for example, for the first time in, I think, Kenya's history, we've had a physical public participation on an important budget document to do with debt called the Medium-Term Debt Strategy Paper, which you normally see around February. You can access it on the Treasury website at any point. We actually saw physical public participation done in 7 counties, right? And this is however many years after we've had the Constitution or Public Finance Management Act. So, but still, even when you read the report from that engagement, it's also not, you can tell that, the feedback that was given in the meeting was actually not really incorporated into the final decision, in the final document. So public participation still, also has some work to do. And then, of course, other challenges like the independence of the independent institution, or their voice, because there's a lot of things that have been raised by the Auditor General, the control of budget, on the definition of debt, on deficiencies, even within the Public Debt Management Office in the National Treasury, right? That, some of these public audit reports show that they even lack capacity in terms of the number of people and the technical skills to actually properly manage debt at the practical level. So these are some of the things that we can point to and say, actually, these could be the reasons why public debt is having a negative effect. And these are the things, if we address, then we can actually move forward the conversation and stop kind of poking the hole or pointing the finger at public debt as this big scary thing, But in terms of where it actually meets the rubber meets the road in terms of solving the situation or making progress in public debt management, it actually points out these specific points that people can actually follow up on. That's state and also non-state actors.
Thanks, Cuba, for highlighting how actually bad governance translates into some of the things that we see with public debt. And at this point, I'd really love us to get into the point where we kind of give some sorts of takeaway and even call to actions to certain government and state and even citizens. Because when you think about public debt, we all have a role to play because we are all affected at one point or another. So maybe based on some of the findings from the paper, borrowing from what has also happened in other countries globally, what are some of the key takeaways, recommendations, action points that would actually give to the different state actors?
Yeah. Thanks. I think let me start with citizens, like myself, which is one, to take some time to read the paper, take some time to educate yourself on these issues of public debt, and particularly, generally public finance. And it doesn't have to be complex. Just pick an issue that you're passionate about and educate yourself about it. On the Bajeti website, we have a lot of resources that you can engage with, including articles, previous research papers, among others. But not just educate yourself, but actually take the opportunities that are made available to participate in the budget process, right? So by the time you're seeing this, we'll probably be heading into budget formulation with decisions like the budget policy statement, with the decisions like the medium-term debt strategy paper, which actually openly, typically, and for the past few years, they've been public forums that you can actually either attend physically or give your views in terms through memorandums online. So stay glued to the National Treasury Twitter or website, and National Assembly as well, because these are real opportunities for you to actually have your views heard, and an encouragement for people who maybe apathetic about public participation. Is of course my reference point will always be the finance bill discussion, right? That it's only through kind of engaging through memorandums and attending those forums of public participation that even certain issues came to light, right? And so I'd say don't give up on the possibility and the value of actually engaging through spaces that have been provided, and where they've not been provided, to actually seek out those spaces. For government institutions, government is very big, so I'll pick maybe the National Treasury for now. I think it's been very positive what has been noted around debt restructuring that's going on, and it's been a call we've been making for a while. So continue along that path. But I think the National Treasury also still needs to understand that public debt and issues of public finance, and of course we've seen progress on this, is not a preserve of boardrooms. It's not a preserve of just government, making those decisions. That there are non-state actors, private sector, civil society, citizen groups, just individual citizens that are more and more willing to engage in the process and to give their views. And so, making steps like improving the processes of giving feedback for public participation, whether it's the annex document, the annex part of the documents that are there. Some of us actually really read those documents. And so I think it's an encouragement to actually improve the quality of public participation so that we can actually take advantage of the capacity, the sheer scope and reach of citizens across the country on issues of public debt and public finance. And then also, of course, to Parliament, which is our representatives in the National Treasury, National Assembly and and the Senate, National Senate. I think it's just to, of course, continue engaging with some of the output that comes out of in terms of research, whether it's from the Parliamentary Budget Office, which is kind of a think tank within Parliament, or non-state actors like Bajeti Hub and some of our partners, to continue engaging citizens, of course, so that the voices of citizens actually make it to budget decisions, because Parliament still remains the number one custodian of public trust in terms of getting involved in budget decisions. And so I think those are some of the parting shots, but or the call to actions. But yeah, I think primarily just take some time to read the paper. There's a longer academic paper that's also there if you want to look into the methodology, if that's your thing. But there's also a series of materials on the topic of public debt that you can also find on Bajeti Hub's YouTube website, among other places.
Thanks, Cuba. A personal one. I know with every research paper that you do, it definitely doesn't answer all the questions. So for this particular paper that you did on social cost and public debt here in Kenya, what are some of the questions that this paper actually left you with?
Several. But the biggest one was whether these challenges in governance are by mistake or by design. And that brings the political aspect of things. And so, how much is what we're seeing in Kenya's public debt crisis a function of politics rather than technical decisions that were made? And of course, we have partners like the National Democratic Institute, Okoa Uchumi, and the Institute for Social Accountability, or TISA, that have been doing research into how politics interplays with public finance and governance. And I think that's some of the aspects of the conversation that actually I'm very interested in and perhaps should be brought to light, because they speak to the real meat of the matter of why things aren't happening, right? Because from the data we can only tell so much. In fact, there's a famous quote that economists say what should happen, politics determines what actually happens,
yeah.
right? So I think that's me trying to take off my economist hat and put on my politician's hat. But yeah, I think that's one of the main questions I'm left with.
As we close, I know when we think about public debt, we'll actually hear a lot of negative things. So people will have negative things to say in terms of public debt, how it has actually impacted their life. But what is that one positive thing that you have also hope for, even as you look at Kenya's public debt in future?
I think the one thing that gives me hope, gives me positive, is the fact that citizens, regular citizens in Kenya and even across the world, because public debt is a problem all over at the moment, they are not letting it slide, in the sense of they're actually getting interested and passionate about public debt as an issue, and it's surrounding issues like public finance, pending bills, all these other things that people care about or may care about. And so what gives me hope is that perhaps a paper like this won't die on a shelf somewhere, that it's actually someone who's interested in understanding why public debt is a problem the way it is, that will actually take this up, and perhaps it'll spark interests or passion in the heart of somebody who's trying to figure out what to do. And so I think that for me, that's what keeps me hopeful: the interest and the desire for change, I think, among Kenyans at the moment.
Thanks. So we'll actually close it here. I know this is not the end of the public debt conversation. We'll definitely have you back on that seat, discussing on more issues to do with public debt. But I really love what you've ended with, that we are living in a generation where we have woke citizens, that there's actually information and people are actually willing to read, understand, enlighten themselves just to understand how some of these budget decisions are actually impacting their daily lives. And it's something that we constantly see even on social media. People are really taking up this. So I think we will close it here. I have been your host, Irene Niva. Until next time, it's a bye-bye.